When 60-year-old Agnes Lark stepped off the sweating train in Cheyenne, with nothing but a patched carpetbag and one trembling letter, she carried more than cloth and thread. She carried hope. The letter had promised a new life, marriage to a widowed rancher who needed a partner for his household and his herd. Agnes had walked the fog-choked lanes of London for decades as a seamstress, fingers nimble from mending lives together, stitch by stitch. The letter felt like a seam in fate, an opening where something whole might be repaired. What she found instead was a look that hollowed out her insides. Gideon Hale studied her as though she were a bolt of fabric he'd never ordered, then sighed as if disappointed by the color or weight. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, each syllable clipped and precise. "I specifically asked for someone who could handle ranch work. I need a woman who can ride, stack hay, hold her own with the hands-on chores, not—" He made a dismissive motion that left Agnes feeling less like a person and more like a returned parcel. She tried to tell him what mattered: steadiness earned by 30 years of turning out garments by lamplight, the endurance of nights spent keeping customers warm and children clothed, the steady hands that could darn a boot or stitch a man's shirt so it looked new. "Strength isn't always measured in pounds, Mr. Hale," she managed. But Gideon had already made up his mind. "I'll book your way east," he said, with the brutal civility of a man who'd decided a thing and wanted it done. That was that. Alone and bewildered on a wooden platform dusted red by cattle hooves and slow trains, Agnes thought the map of her life had folded into itself. Her carpetbag, frayed at the corners, held her most treasured things. Her mother's silver thimble worn smooth from years of use, a small leather packet of her grandmother's porcelain buttons, and a handful of patterned scraps with names of past customers written in faded lead pencil. Those scraps were the ledger of her self-respect. With factory-made shirts replacing bespoke work, her shop had shuttered. The agency letter had arrived the very day the sheriff came with an eviction notice. It had felt like destiny, until Gideon's indifference made it clear that destiny too could be cruel. Have you ever been judged before you had a chance to speak? Think about that for a moment. If this resonates, pause and leave a comment. There are people who need to hear they aren't alone. Agnes spent a night on the depot bench, her bag tucked beneath her chin, listening to the iron lungs of distant locomotives marking departures and arrivals, each whistle a small bereavement. When dawn warmed the wooden planks, she shaded herself beneath the eaves and watched Cheyenne awaken, merchants unlacing crates, cowboys arguing about grazing, and the cattle pens where animals stamped and made halos of dust that turned. Everything ochre. A man worked the pens with a deliberate calm that made him seem part of the land itself. He was tall in a way that made the horizon look smaller, broad-shouldered, hair the color of old silver wire beneath a worn hat. He moved among beasts and men with a tenderness that contradicted the strength of his hands. When he paused and looked up, his pale gray eyes caught Agnes's own. He nodded to her with the kind of recognition that wasn't curiosity or appraisal, only attention. He finished his chore and walked towards the depot instead of to the saloon. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. His voice had the gravel-soft sound of a riverbed. "You rode in last night. You all right? You look like you've had a rough turn." Agnes lifted her chin. A stranger's concern was a fragile, unfamiliar thing. "I'm all right, thank you. Just waiting on the eastbound." He studied her face as if reading a catalog of weather. "I'm Silas Boone," he said. "If you need a place to rest for a bit, there's a line shack not far from here, down by Quail Creek. Quiet, dry, could put you up till you make plans." She wanted to refuse, not out of pride, though pride lived in her bones, but because how often does a lonely woman accept shelter from a broad-shouldered stranger in a territory where gossip bites like winter? "I couldn't impose," she said. "I hardly know you." Silas smiled, a small crease beside his eyes. "Names and coin are what folks first judge," he said. "If I were to offer charity or company only when the town thought it fit, I'd be a poor man in the deepest sense. You look like someone who oughtn't to sleep on a depot bench. Let me at least put a pot on the stove." There was nothing ostentatious in the offer, no fanfare, just practical, steady help, and something in the way he said it warmed the hollow in her chest. "Very well," she said, "if you'll be kind enough." The shack was smaller than Agnes had imagined, a single room with a stone hearth that smelled of good smoke and old pine. Silas had built it himself years ago for line riders waiting to move herds past Quail Creek. Whoever had stayed last had left behind a layer of dust and a kettle that whistled like an old woman scolding the moon when it warmed. "It's been empty a while," Silas said, as he set a tin cup and a slab of bread on a rickety table. He moved with the ease of a man who knew how to make necessities into comfort. "I'll get a bit of bedding from town tomorrow." Agnes accepted the cup, closing her fingers around it as if touch could steady the tremor under her ribs. That first night, heat and human voice layered new textures into the room. The click of her needle as she mended the cuff of Silas's work shirt. The quiet clank of cups, laughter that wasn't forced. For the first time in months, she stitched with a calm that felt like belonging. When he finally let his guard down and told her his story, it was brusque and honest. "I'm not from money," he said. "I had my hand in things, worked hard, saved. Folks around here think I'm a simple rancher because I prefer my boots to my ledger. Maybe they're right." He shrugged, then gave her a look that suggested the shrug concealed more than it revealed. For all his economy of words, he was plainly used to keeping company with solitude. They fell into a routine. Silas brought supplies from town and told stories about trail days. Agnes mended shirts, refashioned a coat that had lost its dignity. And in return, he taught her how to read the lines on a map that spoke of water and wind. Their companionship grew not through grand declarations, but through small, steady acts. A teacup warmed, a shirt repaired, a biscuit shared. News spreads in small towns the way seeds ride wind, quick, indiscriminate, and impossible to unroot. Within 2 weeks, some of the congregation at the little white chapel took note. A woman living with a bachelor out on a remote line shack was, in their view, an item that required pruning. Mrs. Prudence Harrow, chair of the Ladies' Relief, and a woman whose hands had never been anything but neat, called on behalf of the auxiliary. "It's not proper," she said in a whisper that trembled like a piece of fine silk. "An unmarried man with an unmarried woman. What will the town think? Where are the morals if we let things pass?" Agnes felt the sting of the lecture more because of its assumptions than its words. "I accepted shelter," she tried to explain. "Mr. Boone has treated me with nothing but decency." Prudence's eyes tightened. "The town has to maintain its standards. People might talk. For your own good, and the town's, you ought to regularize your position." When Silas heard of the visit, the quiet in his face turned to sharpness. "They'd let a woman freeze at the depot rather than risk a whisper of scandal," he said later, pacing the floor as if his boots could stomp gossip into the ground. "The ones who preach the loudest are often the least charitable." Agnes's heart ached for the sting of social cruelty. She had lived under many roofs and found that pity often traveled in stiff-lipped packages. She had come to Quail Creek for a fresh start, not to become the subject of sermons. Yet even as she bristled, she also felt gratitude for the shelter Silas offered, gratitude that made her protectiveness for him flare. "Do you have a neighbor who judged too quickly? Share this story with them." Sometimes a story softens a hardened heart. A day when Silas had gone into town and lingered longer than usual, Agnes busied herself tidying the cabin. In a drawer beneath his chair, she found papers. Receipts, a ledger, and, tucked beneath them like a secret, a deed. She smoothed it out with hands that trembled less from age than from sudden electricity. The deed named Silas Boone as owner of nearly 2,000 acres of rolling prairie and fenced pastures, a figure of land that made her breath catch like a stallion at the barrier. When he returned and saw the deed in her hand, he didn't deny it. Instead, he folded into a chair like a man who wore the weight of ownership like a weathered coat. "You found my poor attempt at bookkeeping," he said. "Thought I'd put it somewhere it wouldn't get wet. Why hide it?" Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Why pretend to be—" She searched for a word. "Less than you are?" Silas met her eyes, and for a long moment he looked older. "Because people see coin before they see character," he said. "I wanted you to know me before the land told you who I was. I've seen too many friendships sour when a purse decided their worth." Her anger flamed then, less from the omission than from the implication that his silence had been intended to test her. "So you lied." "Perhaps," he admitted. "But I wanted the first thing you'd know of me to be how I treat a person, not how much I own." But did you intend to hide it forever? She asked. Am I your charity case or your companion? Silas rose and sat close enough that she could see the tiny scar across his knuckle from a day when a gate swung wrong. You are not charity, he said softly. You are the first person in a long time I have wanted to be with. I thought if I told you about land first, you might never look at me. She thought of the nights they'd spent, the way he had whittled spoons just because she admired the smooth grain, the way his hands, when not rough with work, had been careful with buttons and thread. Why would I care about how much land you own? She said. Tell me rather why you offered me shelter. Silas's jaw made a small hill under the tan of his skin. Because no one ought to sleep on a depot bench, he said simply. Because my mother taught me to help when I can. And because over a pot of stew and a patched sleeve, I found I liked your company. If gossip was the town's wind, then the law was its fence, and soon both turned toward Agnes. Judge Hollis Crane, a man whose robes were more ceremonial than binding, but whose voice carried as if it were the law itself, made a visit with the kind of official gravity that could turn laughter into a reprimand. Miss Lark, he said, removing his hat, there's been talk. The auxiliary feels this situation reflects poorly. We'd advise regularization of your circumstances. His gaze flicked to Silas like a ledger being balanced. Vagrancy was a flexible charge in frontier towns. Moral turpitude was something the ladies preferred to weigh and scale. Agnes felt suddenly like a garment examined under too bright light. It was one thing to be wronged by a man who refused to take her for who she was. It was another to be told that the remedy for kindness was a public trial. Silas stood in front of her like a fence that would not yield. She's under my roof, he said to the judge. I'll see she's provided for. If there are any legal questions, we'll answer them. But I won't have a woman, especially a woman in need, shamed out on account of some whisper. Judge Crane studied him and nodded. Very well, he said, but be mindful of appearances. The town has eyes. One evening, Silas led Agnes up a low ridge where the valley yawned open and the sun dragged its light across the grass like molten gold. There, half-framed but standing with raw honesty, was a skeleton of a house, timber posts, rough boards, the suggestion of ceilings and rooms. He'd started it with his own hands. I started this the day after you agreed to stay, he said, voice low. Not because I thought I had a right to expect anything, but because the idea took root. He reached into his pocket and brought out a small object wrapped in oilcloth. When he unwrapped it, Agnes saw a worn gold ring, its face soft from years of being held rather than displayed. My mother's ring, he said. I've carried it for 40 years since she passed. I never thought anyone would have reason to wear it again. He knelt on the ridge, dirt pressing into his knees as if he were rejoining the earth. Agnes Lark, he said, I am not asking you because the town requires it. I am asking because in these weeks, the quiet of the nights, the mending of shirts, the laughter, I have come to want you by my side. I offer you shelter, safety, and an honest life. I offer you love. She had loved before in the way one loves one's trade, with devotion and humility. But love with a man was a different stitch to sew, a delicate seam that could unravel if pulled wrongly. She closed her eyes and felt the wind speak through the newly planted studs of the house as if nature itself were blessing what he asked. Will you marry me? Silas asked. The world didn't narrow to a single moment, so much as sharpen into a small, bright pinprick. Yes, she whispered. Yes, because you saw me when others wouldn't. They married beneath a pine arch where friends and a scattering of neighbors gathered. Judge Crane officiated with a dignity that seemed to soften his earlier admonitions. Silas wore a shirt Agnes had mended until it looked new. She wore a blue dress he'd bought, and she'd altered to its kindest shape. The ceremony was plain and honest. Vows exchanged like hand-stitched promises. A cup of coffee shared like communion. Residents had their expectations and their prejudices, and many still whispered. But people also watch how two live after vows are said. When a man and woman work together, their neighbors begin to understand whether scandal is scandal or simply a rumor barreling down empty street. Life settled into the rhythms of honest labor. Agnes set up a small sewing room in the new house where she mended and created garments that came to carry a reputation for durability and beauty. Young brides from neighboring homesteads sent for her hand to fit wedding sleeves. Silas's holdings prospered not because he'd once hidden a deed, but because he farmed with care and paid his hands fairly. People remembered that. 6 months of spring and the first flush of summer taught them the easy small things: how to balance the books, how to coax a stubborn calf, how to plant seeds that would return in kind. They learned the language of partnership, the art of giving a space to each other's strengths. The tin cup they drank from that first night was ringed with new grooves. The quilt Agnes stitched for their bed told a story in each patch, and the line shack that had given them a start became a place friends liked to visit as a memory of what beginnings could germinate. Tag someone who needs to know it's never too late to begin again. 10 years passed before Agnes felt the ache of London's fog as a distant weather instead of a daily sky. Letters still arrived from a cousin who couldn't fathom why she'd pick prairie dust over cobblestone. Her reply was simple, because here she had found herself. In a place where a woman could be dismissed for her size or assumed for her frailty, she had become a woman people sought out for advice, for mending a coat, for quiet counsel. Silas's name remained on the deeds, but his identity had shifted in the town's eye from solitary landowner to partner in a house that gave more than it took. Their story embroidered itself into the community, the couple who welcomed neighbors for bread, who employed seasonal hands with kindness, who set an example that steady goodness often brings its own recompense. Mrs. Prudence Harrow, who once fretted publicly about Daphne's and Agnes's living arrangements, learned to send a basket of curried pies for their autumn feast. Not redemption so much as the slow thaw of a heart that found it easier to do good than to gossip. The line shack still stands on Quail Creek, a small testament to how shelter can shelter more than bodies. The ridge where the house rose bears the shadow of a family now, the sound of children's laughter, and the soft clop of horses returning from pasture. In the main house, a patchwork quilt hangs in the parlor, a wedding ring pattern stitched with thumbs that had once been arrested by age and labor. It's a piece that mends rather than covers, a visible history of two lives woven together. For Agnes, the measure of a life had never been whether she fit some man's expectation. It was about whether she had the courage to walk forward after being told she didn't belong. For Silas, worth was never simply in acres and titles, but in the capacity to notice a person and offer shelter without pretense. Together, their story became a small lighthouse for those washed onto the prairie by circumstance. If this tale moved you, please subscribe to receive more stories that celebrate second chances. Share it with a friend who could use a reminder that character outlasts judgment, and leave a comment about a time when kindness changed your path. Because sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin when we believe our story is over, and sometimes a stranger's hand is the thread that mends us back into something whole,